The sea below was calm, deceptively calm, its glassy surface hiding the carnage that was about to unfold. The roar of twin Wright Cyclone engines shattered the morning silence as Major Edward Larner's B-25 Mitchell hurtled toward the horizon at barely 200 feet. Surled spray lashed the cockpit glass, and the smell of aviation fuel mingled with adrenaline. Through his windscreen the sky was clear, but ahead lay a formation of Japanese transports, 12 ships steaming for Leh under a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. They were confident, disciplined, and unprepared for the hell that was coming. Larner's eyes never left the target. This wasn't an ordinary mission. It was a forbidden one. Standard doctrine said bombers never flew this low. It was suicide, but doctrine hadn't won the Pacific. Desperation had, innovation had, and now in early March 1943, Larner and his men were about to gamble their lives on a technique that hadn't just bent the rules, it had broken them. The order was simple and insane. Drop to 200 feet. Bombs with delayed fuses. Skip them into the ships. The B-25 trembled as flak bursts stitched the sky. The convoy's guns opened up, tracers rising like fiery spears. One hit could tear the Mitchell apart, but Larner kept steady. He could see the lead transport now, its decks crawling with soldiers, its guns blazing toward him. He throttled forward. The altimeter needle hovered over 200 feet. His bombardier, Lieutenant Jack Reynolds, braced himself, hands trembling over the release switch. Larner shouted over the intercom, "Hold steady! Let's give them something to remember." They screamed across the waves, faster than any torpedo could travel. The ship loomed larger, closer, the sea exploding with near misses. Then release. The bombs left the bay, skipped once, twice across the water like thrown stones, and slammed into the ship's hull with a flash of orange fury. A column of fire erupted skyward. Larner banked sharply, the concussion rattling the fuselage. Behind him, the second ship was hit by another Mitchell. The Japanese formation was dissolving into chaos. Smoke plumes tore upward, and men leapt from burning decks into oil-slicked water. For the first time, the Imperial Navy realized what was happening. They were being attacked not from above but from eye level, by bombers moving faster than their guns could track. It was chaos, precision, and savagery all at once. The Bismarck Sea had turned into a furnace. Larner's intercom crackled. Another squadron was making its run. "They're on fire, Major." "They're burning," shouted a voice. The horizon flickered with explosions. Ships tried to turn, colliding in their panic. The air smelled of cordite and death. Larner's crew watched in stunned silence as the convoy that had once seemed invincible began to disintegrate. The mission that had been forbidden, the technique that no manual endorsed, had worked. In less than 15 minutes, 12 ships were reduced to burning wrecks. Larner turned his aircraft toward base, the Pacific sun rising behind a curtain of smoke. He didn't speak. None of them did. What they had done defied every lesson they'd been taught, and yet it had changed everything. The silence in the cockpit was heavier than the roar of engines. Below, the sea boiled with flame and oil, a graveyard for thousands. Above, in the thin blue air, a handful of men had rewritten the laws of aerial warfare. As the last glow of fire faded behind him, Major Edward Larner knew the truth. Sometimes victory required doing what no one else dared. And on that morning over the Bismarck Sea, courage had flown just 200 feet above the waves. Months before that fiery morning over the Bismarck Sea, the Allied Air Command in the South Pacific faced a nightmare without a name. Japanese convoys moved with cold precision, slipping through the narrow corridors of the Solomon and Bismarck Seas under the cover of darkness and cloud. Every attempt to stop them from the air had failed. High-altitude bombing runs missed their targets by hundreds of yards. The ocean swallowed most of the bombs whole. The sea was too vast, the ships too nimble, and the margin for error too great. The US and Australian forces could see the enemy, but they couldn't touch them. Each mission ended the same way. Craters in the ocean, empty bomb bays, and convoys that still reached their destinations. To the men stationed in Port Moresby and Milne Bay, it was humiliation written in smoke. The Japanese supply line to Leh kept pumping reinforcements and ammunition onto New Guinea, feeding an army that refused to die. Every ship that survived meant more soldiers, more artillery, and more blood spilled in the jungles. The brass in Brisbane wanted answers, and fast. The problem was physics. Bombs dropped from altitude simply didn't hit moving targets. The faster a bomber flew, the farther ahead the bombardier had to aim, and the more wind, gravity, and ocean spray corrupted the trajectory. The Imperial Navy's anti-aircraft guns were getting sharper too. Flying low meant instant death. Flying high meant useless bombing. There was no middle ground, until a handful of restless pilots began to think differently. They weren't scientists or engineers, but they had something just as valuable: desperation. Among them was Major Edward Larner, a man whose defiance was matched only by his precision. He and his peers began experimenting unofficially, testing low-level bombing runs over the sea, measuring impact angles, timing detonations, and watching how bombs behaved when they struck water. What they discovered by accident would change the war. When a bomb was released at very low altitude with the right speed and delay fuse, it didn't plunge. It skipped just like a stone. The water slowed it down and sent it ricocheting toward its target in a deadly flat arc. If the fuse was set correctly, it would explode just as it struck or entered the hull, tearing open steel like paper. It was crude science, born not in laboratories but from the cockpits of patched-up B-25s and the instincts of men who'd seen too many convoys escape untouched. But the idea of skipping bombs into ships was blasphemy to command. Official doctrine dictated precision bombing from safe altitudes. The Air Force had invested years training men to calculate trajectories and trust instruments, not gamble their lives skimming the sea. Too dangerous, too unpredictable, they said. Yet to the pilots flying from jungle strips, watching Japanese fleets glide by unscathed, predictability was already killing them. By late 1942, reports from the front painted a grim picture. The Japanese were reinforcing Leh faster than Allied ground forces could respond. Intelligence suggested another massive convoy was on its way, 8 transports and 4 destroyers, carrying thousands of troops. If it reached its destination, New Guinea would be lost. The Allies had no time left for theories. They needed results. In that desperate pressure, the unthinkable became permissible. General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, listened to the wild proposal from his combat pilots. We can hit them if we go in low, 200 feet, maybe less. Kenney was no fool. He knew it bordered on suicide, but he also knew that in war innovation often came from disobedience. He approved the tests. The engineers at Townsville and Port Moresby got to work modifying the B-25 Mitchells, installing forward-firing machine guns, reinforcing wings, and calibrating new bomb fuses. What had begun as desperation was turning into doctrine. For the first time, the Allied Air Command was preparing to fight the war on the sea not from above, but from the edge of the waves. The problem no one could solve was about to meet the men who refused to accept that it couldn't be solved. The idea itself was almost obscene to the men who had been taught to trust bomb sights and altitude tables. Drop an explosive so low it would skim the water, bounce into a ship's side, and detonate where it would do the most damage, at the waterline or beneath the keel, instead of falling from the heavens and exploding harmlessly in the sea. Called derisively at first by some as suicide bombing, and dismissed by doctrine as reckless and unprofessional, skip bombing began as the stubborn, half-accidental child of necessity and the fierce curiosity of combat pilots who had watched convoy after convoy sail away untouched. It had first been tried in scattered night raids, where Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron had proved the principle on the dark Pacific, releasing bombs that behaved like flat stones and struck hulls with shattering effect. Benn's small victories were proof of concept. But his death in January 1943, his B-17 disappearing before he could turn the tactic into doctrine, hardened both the opposition and the resolve among those who remained. The physics were straightforward but unforgiving. At speeds above 200 miles per hour, and at altitudes of roughly 200 feet or less, a bomb with a delayed action fuse would contact the sea, skip forward under inertia, and if timed correctly detonate after it struck or partially penetrated a ship's hull, ripping seams open and wrecking watertight integrity. Too slow, too high, the bomb sank harmlessly. Too late on the timer, and the bomber itself would be within its own blast radius. The devil was in the details. The exact release point relative to the target's bearing, the bomber's attitude, airspeed, sea state, and the fuse delay measured in seconds, and those details had to be learned not in classroom charts, but at treetop level over open water, with the sky full of tracer and the sea filling the windshield. The technique required more than guts. It demanded an entirely different bird. Conventional medium bombers were not built to become flying battering rams. They needed to be remade. In the field, mechanics and improvisers learned how to alter B-25s, beefing up noses, adding forward-firing heavy machine guns to suppress shipboard crews, reworking sights so pilots could aim visually, off a simple reference mark instead of relying on complicated bombing computers, and ordnance specialists retooled fuses so the charge could survive the violent jolt of striking water and still detonate at the right moment. Early tests at isolated reefs and derelict hulks produced a school of hard lessons. A bomb that peeled off once and penetrated properly could split a ship's plating, but premature detonation could send shrapnel into the attacking aircraft. Sea state and wind interfered. Crews learned to judge wave crests by sight and to mark the windscreen so that, at the right instant, the pilot would know to hold the aircraft steady while the bombardier or co-pilot tripped the release. The method's advocates were not theorists, but pilots with bodies tired of watching flared water columns where targets should have been. Men like Major Edward Larner, who would later command whole squadrons in daylight raids, practiced the maneuver until muscle memory overrode terror. Still, the senior staff at 5th Air Force and doctrinal purists understood the risks. They fretted over loss rates and discipline, feared the moral hazard of turning trained crews into gamblers, and worried about the political fallout if a high-profile raid went catastrophically wrong. Yet the earliest operational successes, a string of night sinkings and the clear physics of a weapon that could negate a nimble ship's evasive turns, forced a grudging respect. The technique that had begun as improvisation evolved into procedure: release altitude windows, calibrated fuse timings, coordinated suppressive strafing by gun-armed bombers and low-level fighters to pin down gunners, and the choreography of multiple elements attacking in waves so that ships could not respond to one axis of assault alone. Skip bombing, once a heresy, promised to turn the problem of the uncatchable convoy into a solvable equation. It asked the pilots to fly by instinct rather than instruments, to court death with scientific precision, and to remake both their aircraft and their nerves into tools of a new kind of maritime warfare. In the hush between tests, over reef-strewn bays and rusting hulks, the men who practiced it felt the future of anti-shipping warfare being carved out in salt spray and engine smoke, a future that would demand courage, mechanics' ingenuity, and a willingness to do what orthodox war planners had once forbidden. Major Paul Gunn was not a doctrinal theorist or a desk-bound planner. He was a reckon repairman with a naval aviator's eye for what a fighting airplane could become when tools, fury, and imagination met necessity. And in the humid maintenance sheds of Port Moresby, he built an answer to a problem that generals and engineers had declared insoluble. Gunn's motive was more than professional curiosity. His wife and children were trapped in the Philippines after the Japanese advance, and that private rage fed an urgency to convert concept into killing machine as fast as human hands could fashion it, working with a handful of mechanics, sheet metal workers, and salvaged parts. He stripped the B-25 Mitchell's nose of its glass bombardier compartment and began welding in steel plates and mounting racks of heavy, forward-firing weapons until the bomber's profile resembled a flying gunboat rather than a precision bomber. He installed nose-mounted 50-caliber machine guns, not 2, not 4, but eventually arrays of 8 to a dozen heavy Browning barrels clustered to pour suppression fire straight down a ship's deck, and synchronized them with waist and top guns so that, on a masthead pass, the B-25 would be less a vulnerable target than a mobile hailstorm of armor-piercing rounds. The Gatling-like thunder of the 50s could rip through light superstructure, silence anti-aircraft crews, and punch holes through railings and gun shields long enough for a delayed fuse bomb to find the waterline. Gunn reorganized internal ammo stowage to feed dozens of short, brutal runs. He reinforced the forward fuselage against recoil and small arms fragments, rewired electrical systems to fire multiple guns reliably, and improvised new sighting cues. A simple painted reference mark on the windscreen that let a pilot aim the whole airplane by eye rather than by complicated bomb sight computations unsuited to 200-foot attacks. The conversions were brutal, inventive, and fragile, brackets cut from captured wreckage, mounts cannibalized from crashed aircraft, wiring scavenged and resoldered under mosquito lanterns, but they worked. And they worked because Gunn refused to accept the limits stamped into manuals. The modified Mitchells could now suppress a destroyer's crew long enough for a skip bomb to strike home. They could carry the fuse-timed ordnance that needed to survive a violent water impact, and they could return, often scarred and smoking, to Port Moresby, where Gunn's ground crews would nurse them back with welded patches and sleepless ingenuity. The field workshops were crucibles of improvisation. Maintenance men worked 18-hour days machining brackets from scrap, sewing rudimentary armor, rebalancing propellers after heavy nose armaments changed flight characteristics, and fabricating ammo chutes to stop rounds from shattering in heavy turns, each fix an ad hoc piece of engineering that had never been in any factory blueprint, but which proved crucial when the aircraft met enemy steel at masthead height. Gunn's modifications did more than change hardware. They rewired tactics and temperament. Pilots trained to trust stabilizers and sighting computers now learned to fly by feel, to hold 200 feet over chop and slick with an intimacy that made engineering tables irrelevant. Bombardiers became gunners and pilots became skippers of living artillery, all driven by Gunn's brutal insistence that the airplane be a tool of violent immediacy. He earned a nickname among crews. Some called him a genius, others called him a fanatic, but everyone learned to call his aircraft by another name, the Commerce Destroyer, a flying battleship whose nose guns and skip-bombing doctrine turned transportation fleets into fragile, exploding targets. The conversions were not riskless. A heavy forward battery changed center of gravity and handling. Nose armor and gun mounts introduced structural stresses, and the keyed fuses that had to survive water impact were themselves delicate and temperamental. Yet Gunn's shops found workarounds. They beefed up mounting plates, rewired safety interlocks, and developed checklists that reduced in-flight failures. More than once, men cursed the crude look of the modified B-25, ugly, top-heavy, almost obscene in its brutality. But ugliness did not matter when the result was a burning transport and flares of men in the sea. What Paul Gunn manufactured in Port Moresby was not only a machine but a doctrine in metal. He made possible the marriage of suppressing fire and timed ordnance, and in doing so, he gave commanders a tool that converted raw courage into calculated lethality. The Commerce destroyers rolled off crude ramps and took to the sky with ammunition boxes lashed to their bellies and the smell of welding flux still in their seams, and for the men who flew them, Gunn was less an officer than an architect of vengeance, a man who reshaped an airplane with his own hands and forced the Pacific to learn a new, brutal geometry of attack. By the dawn of 1943, Major Edward Larner had already survived more low-level sorties than most pilots dared attempt in a lifetime. Yet nothing could have prepared him for what the 5th Air Force was about to unleash. The skip-bombing doctrine was still experimental, its mathematics improvised, its results unpredictable, and its risks fatal. But for Larner, disciplined, relentless, and quietly fearless, it was an opportunity to do what no textbook could ever teach, turn the impossible into method. His baptism into this new form of warfare came not in a classroom or training field, but in the humid coastal air of New Guinea, where the jungle pressed against the edges of the runway, and every takeoff meant flying straight into chaos. The men called it mast-height flying, but that phrase hid its insanity. Flying a 20-ton B-25 Mitchell, just 200 feet above the ocean at 230 miles per hour, was less flight than defiance. The altimeter barely twitched. One mistake, one gust of wind, and the sea would swallow them whole. Yet that was the point. Surprise came only from silence, and survival depended on precision measured in fractions of seconds. Larner's first test runs were brutal lessons in humility. Bombs released too early skipped wide of their targets. Others detonated too soon, sending geysers of salt water and steel fragments that shook the aircraft. The mechanics adjusted fuse delays by trial and error. The pilots recalculated their approach angles, using little more than intuition and nerve. Every run was an act of faith in numbers scribbled on oily clipboards and the instincts of men who had stared too long into death's shadow. Still, Larner persisted. He flew again and again over coral bays, dropping inert test bombs against derelict freighters, left from earlier battles, watching how they leapt across the waves before striking metal. He memorized the rhythm, the heartbeat of the maneuver. Throttle open, nose steady, target dead ahead, release point flashing past in an instant. He could feel it rather than calculate it, like a pianist playing from muscle memory instead of reading notes. "You don't bomb," he told his crew. "You throw." That was the new gospel of low-altitude attack, and it worked. One test after another proved the concept could annihilate a ship when done with precision and timing. The delayed fuses detonated just as the bombs slid beneath the hull, tearing ships apart from below where armor meant nothing. Each success brought cheers, but also a grim awareness this was not theory anymore. The next run would be against men shooting back. The official briefing for the 90th Bombardment Squadron was terse. Reconnaissance had identified a Japanese convoy moving from Rabaul to Lae, 8 transports and 4 destroyers, carrying reinforcements, fuel and weapons. If those ships reached New Guinea, Allied ground forces would face another disaster. The mission: intercept and destroy the convoy at all costs. Larner volunteered without hesitation. His B-25, patched with metal scavenged from wrecks, carried the new forward-firing guns Gunn's crews had installed. The nose was heavy, the recoil violent, but the firepower absolute. The night before takeoff, Larner walked the flight line in silence. Mechanics worked under lanterns, loading 50 caliber belts, checking fuel lines, painting bomb fins. The air smelled of oil and fear. "We're breaking every rule they ever taught us," his co-pilot muttered. Larner only nodded. "Then let's make a new one." Dawn rose over Port Moresby like a warning. Engines coughed to life, propellers spinning silver arcs in the pale light. One by one, the B-25s lifted from the ground and vanished into the morning haze, heading north toward the Bismarck Sea. Below them lay the blue expanse that had swallowed so many pilots before. Ahead of them waited the largest Japanese convoy seen in months. In that moment, as his aircraft leveled out at 200 feet, Edward Larner felt no fear, only purpose. This was not an experiment anymore. It was war remade in real time, and his squadron was about to baptize the new doctrine of skip bombing in fire and blood. Intelligence turned the ocean into a chessboard. Signals and sightings arranged the pieces, and the Allied commanders set a trap the Japanese would not see until it was already too late. In the weeks before March, codebreakers in Brisbane and radio men in the South Pacific had worked in a grim relay. Intercepts parsed, patrol reports filed, and reconnaissance sorties combed the blue for a column of grey hulls that intelligence suggested would steam from Rabaul toward Lae. The convoy that left Rabaul did so with confidence and calculation. 8 transports loaded with troops and equipment, escorted by a ring of destroyers and screened by veteran Zero fighters, planned to slip down the northern coast of New Britain under weather that Japanese planners believed would blunt Allied air attack. The Imperial Navy trusted numbers, seamanship and the cover of cloud. The Allies trusted broken codes and patience. When the Liberator spotted them through a thinning overcast, the dominoes fell. George Kenny, who had argued for unorthodox solutions, orchestrated a multi-layered strike. Heavy B-17s would arrive first at medium altitude to force the convoy into maneuvers and to present a familiar threat. Australian bullfighters and other low-level attack planes would sweep in at wave-top height to shred decks and confuse gunners. Then, precisely when chaos and exposure peaked, the converted B-25 commerce destroyers would scream in at masthead altitude, guns biting, bombs poised to skip. The plan read like a brutal poem of coordination. Timing was the stanza where victory would be written. Weather interfered at first. Cloud banks swallowed the sea and delayed reconnaissance, and frustration mounted as hours slipped away. But the ocean conspired with the Allies on the morning of March 3rd. The cloud deck parted. Reconnaissance radioed exact coordinates, and the strike package assembled over Cape Ward Hunt, like a vulture formation coming to a kill. From his cockpit, Larner watched the band of ships below, their wakes drawing white furrows through blue water, and understood instantly the scale of what he and his comrades were about to attempt. The convoy was not a random collection of hulls, but a tightly managed lifeline. Each transport was a small city of men, supplies, and the very possibility of prolonged Japanese resistance in New Guinea. Destroyers steamed in disciplined circles, their crews drilled in anti-aircraft fire, their bridges bristling with men who had spent months perfecting the timing of tracer and lead. The escort looked ominous, But it was not invulnerable, only confident. Kenny's scheme depended on breaking that confidence. The opening salvo of B-17s did what it was meant to. From altitude, they painted the sea with white geysers, forcing captains to alter course and creating a cacophony of defensive fire that masked the approach vectors of the lower elements. Then came the bow fighters, razor-fast, brutal on the deck, strafing with cannons that punched through light armor and detonated shells on open decks. The Japanese gunners, trained to arc their fire upward at high-altitude threats, were momentarily bewildered by fighters that hugged the horizon. Men fell. Mounts were silenced, and bridges were shredded by metal. With the convoy's formation fraying, the stage was set for Larner's squadron. They descended from 2,000 to 200 feet, engines whining and noses pointed like spears. As they slashed across the water, their forward 50s opened in a gutter of tracer that swept decks clean, and the sight of American machine gun fire cutting down gun crews hardened resolve into panic aboard the transports. Captains threw their vessels into desperate turns. Men lashed at guns with hands slick from grease and fear. Then, with the cold efficiency of men who had practiced the maneuver until fear gave way to muscle memory, the B-25s released their delayed fuse bombs. The weapons skipped 1, 2, 3 across the Pacific surface like monstrous stones and collided with metal hulls where armor could not protect. Explosions tore through sides and underkeels, and the once proud convoy convulsed into fire and smoke. Japanese fighters tried to intervene, but P-38s cleared the skies with lethal speed. Destroyers that attempted to close were met with concentrated strafing, and in minutes, the neat geometry of formation dissolved into a chaotic drift of burning transports and desperate survivors. The mathematical certainty Kenny had sought, an equation of timing, speed, and suppression, worked. What left the convoy in ruins was not a single act of bravery, but a carefully choreographed synthesis of intelligence, aircraft modification, and doctrine pushed to its limits. When the last bomber pulled away, the Bismarck Sea was littered with wreckage and oil. The convoy that had left Rabaul under confident escort had become the convoy of doom, a tactical and moral turning point whose shockwaves would ripple through Japanese naval thinking for the rest of the campaign. The morning of March 4, 1943, dawned like a curtain lifting on the aftermath of a cataclysm. The Bismarck Sea was no longer an expanse of calm blue. It was a boiling graveyard of smoke, twisted steel, and scattered men clinging to wreckage. The sky hung low with the stench of burning oil, and the sea itself seemed to groan under the weight of the dead. Yet for Major Paul Pappy Larner and the men of the 5th Air Force, the battle was not over. What had begun as a daring assault had now evolved into a full-blown extermination mission, a storm of vengeance raining down on the remnants of Japan's once proud convoy. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft confirmed what the bombers already knew. Only a handful of Japanese destroyers remained afloat, limping westward under clouds of smoke, their decks slick with blood and fire. The rest, the transports carrying thousands of soldiers destined to reinforce Leh, were gone, reduced to fiery hulks or sinking shadows. Larner's squadron, refueled and rearmed, was ordered back to finish what they had started. There would be no respite, no mercy. As he taxied his B-25 down the dusty strip at Dobodura, Larner knew he was flying not just to destroy ships, but to break the last illusion of Japanese naval invincibility in New Guinea's waters. What awaited them was chaos incarnate. The Japanese survivors, scattered across miles of ocean, were being strafed by low-flying bow fighters and bombed by heavy liberators. Destroyers like Arashio and Asashio, noble veterans of earlier Pacific battles, were now burning wrecks surrounded by the flotsam of death. Smoke columns rose like black towers, visible even from 20 miles away. Yet even in their desperation, the Japanese fought back. Their anti-aircraft gunners, some half-blinded by smoke and spray, fired upward with grim defiance, their tracers arching through the haze in a futile attempt to swat away the swarm of Allied aircraft. Larner's crew dove into the inferno once again, hugging the waves so closely that salt spray streaked the cockpit glass. Their targets were the crippled destroyers, the last thread of organized resistance on the sea. As they closed in, the scene was apocalyptic. Burning soldiers flailed in the water. Others floated motionless beside capsized rafts. Explosions rippled across the sea as fuel tanks ruptured, and the heat rose in shimmering waves that distorted vision. Still, the bombers pressed on, their machine guns roaring in relentless rhythm. "No stopping now," Larner muttered through clenched teeth as tracer rounds streaked past his nose. He lined up on Audacious, a proud destroyer now reduced to a drifting inferno. His bombardier, steady despite the hellish scene, released two 500-pounders that skipped once, twice, and struck home. The explosion shattered the ship's spine, sending a column of flame hundreds of feet high. When the smoke cleared, Audacious was gone, swallowed by the sea that had once carried her to glory. Around him, the battle dissolved into slaughter. Viewfighters strafed lifeboats and rafts, determined to ensure no reinforcements reached the shore. The Japanese soldiers, hardened by years of propaganda about dying for the emperor, refused to surrender. Many waved rifles or swords defiantly, even as they sank beneath the waves. It was war stripped to its brutal essence. No heroism, no mercy, only survival. Over the radio, Larner heard one pilot mutter, "It's like shooting men in the water," his voice hollow with disbelief. Another replied grimly, "They'd do the same to us." By the time the final Allied sortie withdrew, the sea was quiet again. Thousands of Japanese troops, nearly an entire division, had been wiped out in 48 hours. Not a single transport survived. The Japanese command, stunned and humiliated, would later call it a great tragedy. But for the Allies, it was vindication, the proof that their new low-altitude tactics, their skip-bombing innovations, and their relentless coordination had changed the face of air warfare. As Larner's B-25 turned for home, he looked down at the endless field of wreckage below, a twisted, burning testament to what had just unfolded. The storm had broken, and its fury had rewritten the rules of war. It was just 15 minutes, barely enough time for a man to finish a cigarette or for a sunrise to fully break over the Pacific horizon. Yet in that fleeting quarter hour on March 3, 1943, the nature of naval warfare was rewritten forever. The Bismarck Sea, once a quiet corridor for Japanese supply lines, became the stage for an aerial assault so swift, so devastating, that it shattered centuries of naval doctrine. Gone were the days when fleets dueled from miles apart, exchanging broadsides like floating fortresses. Now death came screaming in from the clouds, fast, precise, and unstoppable. The innovation that made it possible wasn't a new battleship, nor a secret weapon of unimaginable power. It was a simple idea born out of desperation and ingenuity: skip bombing. Major Pappy Larner and the men of the 5th Air Force had perfected it in the jungles and airstrips of New Guinea, turning medium bombers into ship killers. The technique defied everything traditionalists had been taught. Instead of climbing to safety and releasing bombs from altitude, the pilots would dive to treetop height, racing across the waves so low that their propellers nearly kissed the surf. They'd release their bombs at just the right moment, watching them bounce like stones skipping across a pond, until they struck the hulls of enemy ships and exploded with catastrophic precision. It was suicidal in theory, but in practice it worked with surgical brutality. That morning, the Japanese convoy, 8 transports escorted by 8 destroyers, was locked in formation, unaware that its doom was minutes away. They had survived air raids before, relying on tight defensive patterns and layers of anti-aircraft fire, but they had never faced this. The first wave of Allied aircraft appeared out of the eastern haze, flying impossibly low, the roar of their engines echoing like thunder across the sea. Viewfighters came in first, raking decks with 20mm cannon fire, shredding gun crews and leaving the ships defenseless. Then came Larner's B-25s, armed with 500-pound bombs and nerves of steel. They flew through sheets of tracer fire, so close to the water that enemy gunners overshot them entirely. Larner's squadron leader, a calm voice amid the chaos, barked into the radio, "Hold the line, release at 300 yards. In those next 15 minutes, hell itself opened up on the Bismarck Sea. Bombs skipped and slammed into hulls, detonating with seismic force. The transport Kyokusei Maru erupted in a tower of flame. Teiyo Maru split in half, its decks consumed by explosions. Oigawa Maru vanished beneath a black curtain of smoke. The destroyers tried to maneuver, but with their decks ablaze and rudders shattered, they became easy prey. The sea was on fire, littered with the debris of men and metal. Japanese survivors would later recall it as a rain of steel, a moment when every instinct to fight or flee was overwhelmed by sheer shock. Even the Allied pilots were stunned by the carnage they had unleashed. 15 minutes. That was all it took for an entire Japanese invasion force to be reduced to burning wreckage. What naval artillery couldn't achieve in hours, the precision and daring of low-altitude bombers accomplished in moments. When the smoke cleared, the convoy that had left Rabaul with over 6,000 troops was gone. Only a handful of men clung to life, scattered across an oil-slicked sea. The Japanese Navy, stunned into silence, would never again attempt a major daylight convoy through New Guinea waters. In Tokyo, strategists were forced to confront a grim truth. Their supremacy at sea no longer depended on ships. It depended on the skies they could not control. Meanwhile, at Allied command posts, the mood was electric. What had begun as an experiment by maverick pilots was now hailed as a tactical revolution. Air power, General Kenny declared, just made the ocean obsolete. 15 minutes of fire, fury, and fearless innovation had changed the very rhythm of war, and forever tilted the Pacific tide toward victory. When the thunder faded and the smoke thinned, the ocean was no longer blue, it was black with oil, blood, and ash. The wreckage of 12 Japanese ships drifted silently across the Bismarck Sea, their flames reflected in the rolling waves like dying stars. The mission had been a triumph, a masterpiece of tactical brilliance that would echo through every command room of the Pacific War. But for those who had been there, those who had flown through that wall of fire, who had seen men leaping from burning decks into an inferno below, victory did not feel like glory. It felt heavy. It felt hollow. And for Major Edward Larner, it would be the most haunting 15 minutes of his life. In the hours after the battle, the airmen landed at their forward base on the northern coast of New Guinea, still running on adrenaline and disbelief. Mechanics and medics rushed to the returning bombers, their fuselages scarred and pitted from flak, wings singed from near misses. One aircraft came in on a single engine, another had holes large enough to see daylight through the cabin. Larner climbed out of his cockpit, his flight suit soaked in sweat, his face streaked with grime and salt. Reporters and officers waited to shake his hand, but his eyes were distant, searching the horizon as though he could still see the fires burning far to the north. Behind the cheers and congratulations, there was silence, an unspoken understanding among the pilots that what they had witnessed could never be forgotten. Word of the battle spread fast. Across Allied bases, the story was told with awe and disbelief. A Japanese convoy annihilated in 15 minutes, a new bombing tactic that turned medium aircraft into naval destroyers. But as the details emerged, the strafing of lifeboats, the sight of men swimming in flaming oil, the story grew darker. Larner's squadron had received orders to make sure no survivors reached shore. It was the cold arithmetic of total war. If those men lived, they would fight again in the jungles of New Guinea, killing Allied soldiers weeks later. Still, for many pilots, the act gnawed at them. "We weren't shooting at ships anymore," one airman later recalled. "We were shooting at men." That night in the makeshift officers' club, whiskey flowed like water. The men laughed too loudly, clinked glasses too hard, and spoke too quickly, as if the noise could drown out the screams still echoing in their minds. Larner sat apart, his drink untouched. He had executed his mission perfectly. He had done what was required, what was expected, and yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like something that could never be undone. When a young mechanic congratulated him, Larner only nodded and said, "We did our job." But don't ever think it was easy. In the following days, reconnaissance flights confirmed what the pilots already knew. The Japanese convoy had ceased to exist. Thousands of enemy soldiers, sailors, and officers were dead. Allied losses were minimal. Strategically, it was a perfect victory. Psychologically, it was something else entirely. Pilots reported nightmares, flashes of burning ships, of faces in the water. The same men who had once feared nothing now woke in the night drenched in sweat. The brutality of the low-altitude strikes had been necessary, but it had also forced them to see their enemy not as dots on a map, but as men, close enough to see the whites of their eyes before releasing the bomb. For the Japanese, the defeat was beyond catastrophic. Tokyo's high command declared 3 days of silence, and the Imperial Navy began reassessing its entire strategy in the Southwest Pacific. For the Allies, it was proof that innovation, courage, and sheer audacity could shatter even the mightiest formations. Yet buried beneath the official reports and victory communiques the human toll lingered. The men of Larner's squadron had rewritten the rules of aerial warfare, but they had also learned that every revolution comes with a price. And in the lonely hours after the battle, that price was paid not in medals or promotions, but in memory, in the faces of those they had destroyed to secure victory. When the smoke of the Bismarck Sea finally cleared, it left behind not just wreckage, but revelation. What Major Edward Larner and his men had done in those furious 15 minutes would ripple far beyond that narrow stretch of Pacific water. The low-altitude strikes that annihilated an entire Japanese convoy had proven something the world's greatest admirals had never wanted to admit, that the age of the battleship was dying, and the future of warfare belonged to those who commanded the skies. Yet for all its tactical brilliance, the legacy of the Bismarck Sea was written as much in blood as in innovation. The Allies had demonstrated not just courage, but cold precision, an evolution of war that blurred the line between victory and devastation. In the weeks that followed, the 5th Air Force became a symbol of a new kind of military power. Larner's squadron and others like it turned their B-25 Mitchells into the terror of Japanese shipping. The method they had refined, skip bombing at 200 feet, was now standard procedure across the Pacific. Crews trained relentlessly to perfect it, learning how to skim the sea, time their drops to the second, and use the waves themselves as weapons. What began as a desperate improvisation had become doctrine. General George Kenney proudly told Washington that his pilots could now kill ships better than ships can. For the Japanese, there was no longer any safe harbor. Convoys that once carried supplies, fuel, and reinforcements to New Guinea and the Solomons were reduced to smoldering debris within days. Their empire, stretched thin across an unforgiving ocean, began to unravel from within. But while commanders praised the success, those who had lived it carried the weight of what it meant. Major Larner never forgot the images of that burning sea. In the months after the battle, he flew more missions, each one precise, ruthless, and efficient, but he grew quieter, more withdrawn. His men noticed the way he stared out at the horizon after each flight, his eyes lost in memories no medal could erase. In late 1943, his aircraft went missing over the Huon Gulf. No wreckage was ever found. To his squadron, he became both a legend and a ghost, a man who had changed the course of the war, yet vanished into the very sky that had made him immortal. The Bismarck Sea victory transformed Allied strategy. Naval and air forces began coordinating in ways never seen before. The concept of air superiority, once a theoretical advantage, became the foundation of every offensive plan from the Philippines to Okinawa. Even the great naval battles that followed, like the Marianas Turkey Shoot and Leyte Gulf, were decided not by armor or artillery, but by the reach of bombers and the precision of pilots who flew low, fast, and fearless. The forbidden tactics once dismissed as madness had become the blueprint of modern warfare. After the war, historians would look back on that March morning as a turning point, the moment when courage and science fused into strategy. The Japanese had underestimated the Americans' ability to adapt, to innovate under pressure. They had built an empire on discipline and tradition, only to see it undone by audacity and invention. The Allies had built more than bombs and planes. They had built ideas that evolved faster than their enemies could react. Today, when airmen study skip bombing, when documentaries recount the Bismarck Sea, it is not just the destruction that is remembered, it is the daring. The way men like Larner took aircraft designed for altitude and turned them into instruments of close-range annihilation. The way they rewrote the book on aerial warfare in a matter of days. The sea that once burned with fire and oil now rests calm again, but beneath its surface lies the wreckage of a lesson history will never forget. The price of progress was human, the outcome undeniable. In 15 minutes, Edward Larner and his squadron didn't just win a battle. They proved that innovation, when fused with courage, could alter the destiny of nations. And that is the true legacy of fire.